Holy Gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen, until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to you, O Christ.
Jesus. Some years ago, when I was a single man on the island, there was a woman who from time to time, when we crossed paths, would say to me, "You need to meet my cousin Lizard." She said, "I like to call her Lizard. I think the two of you would get along great." And I thought, if her nickname is Lizard, maybe not. Some years later, when I had busy morning church, I was back at the rectory in the afternoon, the same person came to my front door and said, "This morning you met my cousin." And I was trying to think, 8 o'clock service, 10 o'clock service, coffee hours, what I had done after. I couldn't figure it out. She said, "The one at Ted Aller's service, who you were talking to." Ted Aller had been retiring, and I'd gone to his retirement after coffee hour. And I said, "That's your cousin Lizard?" And in that moment, who she had been in my mind was absolutely transformed into a new figure, into a new person, into a new understanding. As I've thought this week about what could I describe for you as a kind of transfiguration, that was the image that came to my mind best. The moment when a lizard turned into a lady who turned into the woman that I ultimately married. I married the lizard. She was no longer a lizard to me. Her name is Libby. I think that's why she called her Lizard, by the way. Lizard, Libby. It was not that close, but in her mind it worked perfectly. There are times in our lives when who we figure someone is, because of new information, a new insight, gets transformed into a new understanding. We now figure who we figure they are is new, and it's more profound, and it's more deeply insightful than it was. What we figured was changed, this transfiguration. In the Gospel of Mark, the transfiguration for Jesus occurs right in the very middle of the Gospel. There's 16 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, and this happens in chapter 8. And in Mark's Gospel, we have Jesus being baptized, which is a moment of revelation. The heavens are torn open, and God says, "This is my Son, the beloved." But it only happens to Jesus. 8 chapters in, halfway through the body of the Gospel, on the mountain, Jesus is transfigured, but now he's transfigured in this moment of revelation in the eyes of Peter and James and John. Suddenly, who they figured he was is transformed. He's transfigured to them. And they suddenly realize with a new insight who he really is, who he's been all along, and who he can be for them. There is a last moment of revelation in Mark's gospel that happens all the way at the end. You might think it's the resurrection, but Mark's gospel has a very, very tiny resurrection. It's almost none. They come to the tomb and it's empty, and the angels say, "Go back to Galilee, you'll see him everywhere." But the moment of revelation really then is the centurion who's standing at the cross. And after Jesus dies, this man who's been watching the whole thing unfold, and as the temple's been torn in two, and there was a great eclipse, even this man who stands for Rome, who stands for the Gentiles, looks and says, "Truly this man was God's son." So Mark's gospel is very beautiful this way. The transfiguration that happens in some sense in the world, but only in the eyes and understanding of Jesus, then in the eyes and understanding of his disciples, and finally in the eyes and understanding of the Gentiles and of the rest of the world. Of all the things we could try to take from this gospel today, what I would most encourage you to take, what I'd most love for you to take, is the place of Peter, James, and John. Rather than trying to sort of probe deeply into the mysteries of the transfiguration, I think what we most need is to have Jesus be transfigured for us. You see, I want to encourage you to stand there in the place of Peter, James, and John. To consider, when you look at Jesus, who do you figure he is? Who have you figured he is? What have you figured out about Jesus? And maybe it's limited. Maybe it's limited. Over the course of time, you said, well, the world says all these things, but these are the things that I really believe. These are the things that I really hold. These are the things I really understand. I figured this was probably really who he was. And like I say, maybe it's very big, or maybe it's a subset of those things. But in the eyes of the disciples, Jesus is suddenly transfigured where they realize that he is more. He's more than they ever expected. He's more than they ever understood. And I think what we need in our spiritual lives are these moments of transfiguration that continue to draw us forward so we don't become stagnant. So we don't simply create a Jesus and, well, I've got that all figured out, but to be reminded this morning and maybe continually that he's always more than we realize, more than we understand, that there's more on the margins that maybe we have cut out that actually belongs on the inside. And in fact, if we can do that more and more, maybe he might even suddenly be revealed to us as just a flash of blinding light. A moment of pure insight, of connection that transcends words or concepts or understandings. Suddenly a recognition that maybe Jesus is beyond our understanding, but we understand him to be that. In all the details of the transfiguration, I think Mark is trying to bring us to this place. And what I'd like to do in the balance of this sermon is maybe to go through each of the details of the transfiguration, invite you to recognize what Mark is telling us, and to find out if you've been there before, and if you haven't been there before, what would it mean if you added that to your understanding? Would it be wonderful if by the end of this morning or by the end of this week, you could have one of those sudden flashes of insight? Mark tells us that Jesus led Peter, James, and John up the mountain. And in some basic sense, we can start just with the word Jesus. He really existed. He was really a man. Yes, it's actually true that some people doubt whether there was a Jesus. There's more evidence that Jesus existed than Julius Caesar. We have all of these contemporaneous accounts, all of these quotations, even historians in the Roman world who weren't Christian were commenting on all of the data and all the facts and all of the understanding. Jesus existed. He was a real man. He walked the earth and he did these things. Jesus leads Peter, James, and John up the mountain. What Mark's hoping we'll see here is that, you see, Peter, James, and John were the three great lights in the church. If you were in the early church, you would have known Peter, James, and John better than you would have known Jesus. Because Jesus had died and risen and ascended, but Peter, James, and John were the ones who were making the proclamation. You would have known their words. Peter was the one who was the head of the disciples, who was in charge of all of Christianity within Israel and seems to have been the chief evangelist of the entire nation and the leader of the apostles. James was Jesus' brother. He's described this way in the Gospels. James becomes in charge of the church in Jerusalem after the resurrection and ascension. James, you might have thought Peter was in charge of Jerusalem. Peter was in charge of the whole place. But James was the one who was in the church in Jerusalem, who led the Jerusalem church, which arguably would have been the most important one. Over time, Rome might have become the most important one. But in the beginning, it was Jerusalem. And John was Jesus' best friend. You read the Gospel of John. At the Last Supper, John is like laying on Jesus' chest. John is just laying on Jesus. Like John is called in the Gospel of John the beloved disciple. John is like the one closest to Jesus' heart. That's why John's Gospel is so deeply insightful about the character of Jesus. Peter, James, and John. And what Mark is telling us is that Jesus is the one leading them all. When you think about the teaching of the church, the authority of the church, the religion of the church, the liturgy of the church, the mission of the church, all of these things, when someone asks you, who are the church leaders you admire, and you might say your priest, or you might think about the bishop, or you might think about someone from ages ago who was wonderful and powerful, St. Francis of Assisi, the great leader of the church is Jesus. He's behind all of it. And he's the one that everything should be coming towards. And he's the one who's leading us into where we need to go. Jesus is the one who is first. And behind all of this is Christ. Jesus leads them up on a high mountain. And in some sense, this is now taking Jesus to an even more profound place. Even a place maybe beyond the place of anyone else you've ever known. And we're starting to get into theology. We're starting to get into a movement of faith and an understanding of the heart. To be up on the high mountain is to say that Jesus is the head of all creation. He's the greatest human being that has ever been. And he is the perfect creation, the one perfect creation in all the universe. But what does that mean? Jesus is the greatest human being there has ever been. Was he faster than Usain Bolt? I don't know how he could sprint. Maybe not. Could he paint better than Michelangelo? I don't know. Probably not. What does it mean to say that Jesus was the greatest human being who ever was? It's not in a particular skill, in a particular action. It's in his humanity. He was the best human. Okay? Not the best painter, not the best architect, not the best at geometry. Good. Maybe he wasn't good at it either. It's okay. He was the best human being. Jesus was the best human being there ever was or ever could be. What does that mean? It means in his nobility. He stood head and shoulders above the rest. In his compassion, he was unmatched. In his ability to love and to care, no one could touch him. In his courage, in his desire and willingness to serve, in his reaching out to those who were on the margins. No one was better at understanding or caring or gathering those people forward. He was the best human being there has ever been, and the best human being there could be. He's that high. And not only that, but the scriptures are telling us he's the greatest in all creation. And why is that? Because he's been made by the hand of God. So he's been made perfect, right? But also in his agreement with God, which is to say in his faithfulness. He was the highest of all creation. Because not only was he made perfect, but in his heart, he gave himself completely to God's will. And so in that sense, thinking the whole universe wide, there Jesus stands alone above everything. And here's where you might finally get to the place where you say Jesus is Lord. This is why Jesus is Lord. Because Jesus is the one who really existed, who leads the whole church and everything, who's the greatest human being there could be, and the one who is alone perfect in all that has ever been. If anyone should be followed, if anyone should be listened to, it is Jesus. And hopefully maybe already in some places in your mind or heart, you're starting to see something maybe you hadn't seen, or to embrace something in a different way you hadn't embraced. It goes beyond this, because in that moment, Jesus is transfigured before them into light. We're now going into the mystical realm. He's transfigured for them into light. And here I want you to imagine, is my voice doing well? Thank goodness. Here I want you to imagine a world where there's not much light, where there's not electric lights everywhere, and lights on the street everywhere, and you can have a light and a flash, and you can clap your hands and there could be light. I mean, it's become so simple and so sort of trite. This is something to be ignored or taken for granted of. 2,000 years ago, light was precious. The one light that would rise in the sky, that would give light to all, and without it there would be nothing. Go outside in the dark back in those days, in a new moon where there's no moonlight, and now you know what darkness is like. True, profound darkness where you can't tell anything, you don't understand anything, nothing is clear, you can't even see your hand in front of your face, much less the things in the room or the organization of the things in the world. How precious light would be in that time. How precious it would be to go into the darkness and have a single candle. And that candle helps you understand everything and see all of it and understand everything in the room or everything in that place. That one single light making the profound difference, or a single window that gives all the light to the room. Saying Jesus is the light, he transforms into light, is telling us that in Christ teaches us the truth about everything. Jesus is the revelation. He is the light that helps you understand who you are. Through Jesus, we understand who the world is. Through Jesus, we understand why we're here. Through Jesus, we understand God. Through Jesus, we understand what's true. Through Jesus, we see what real love is. Through Jesus, we understand how we're supposed to act. Through Jesus, we can judge what is true and we can judge what's not true. In Jesus, in the light, we have perfect revelation that gives light to our world, talking about like in metaphor and symbol, in concept. Jesus becomes perfect light, which means he is the truth. And everywhere he shines, he helps us to see truth. This is why in that moment, Moses and Elijah appeared to him. These were the two ways that up until this moment, the ancient Israelites had understood what was true. Law tells us what's true, and the prophets were about the heart. Because the law couldn't command the heart. There was a problem with the law. You do these things, but do you really care, or are you just going through the motions? And so it was necessary to the prophets who would say, you might be doing what's right, but your heart is far from me. And between the two of them, you had basically the whole human creation. You had what you should do and why you should do it, the action and the feeling and the compassion that should be a part of it. And in that moment, both of them are there speaking to Jesus. Because Jesus is the truth behind the law, you see. And Jesus is the one that is the truth behind the passion, behind the heart, behind the way. In some sense, we're getting, I am the way and the truth and the light. It's sort of interesting, because that's from John's gospel. And John doesn't have a transfiguration. But John has Jesus saying, I am the way and the truth and the light. All three of them there comprehended on the mountaintop. Here's where I want you to think about, where do you go to find out what's true? Who do you follow as a earthly leader, a teacher? Maybe there's a philosopher you like. Maybe there's someone on social media who you follow because the things they say are insightful. They help you understand something. To see Jesus transformed is to recognize that behind any truth stands Christ. Anything that's true, anything that's real, anything that matters, anything that reflects what's deep and insightful, Jesus himself is behind it. That truth is embodied in him. And to go to Jesus, you'll find that, and usually find something more. It sort of even takes us beyond Christianity into sort of transcendent religiosity, which is to say, if wherever you look, if you look at other faiths, you look at other philosophies, other worldviews, or other insights, anything in them that might be true, and there are things in all of them that are true, that Jesus is the light that stands behind them. And through Jesus as the light, we can see that in them. And so in this moment, Jesus has now become the greatest on earth. He's become the greatest in heaven. And it's in this moment, interestingly, that suddenly a cloud descends on them. Because as you get close to God, you understand more and more and more and more, and then less. Because God is ultimately a mystery. And so as they're beginning to perceive Jesus as sort of the truth and the light and the love behind all things, suddenly they recognize their blindness. It's also emphasized in what Peter says. They recognize that in some sense all of this is beyond them. It's more than they can know, more than they can comprehend. They find themselves in the cloud, in the darkness, but in that place a voice speaks to them and says, "This is my son." And if there was any question, then this finalizes the link. He's not just the best human being. He's not just the best in creation. He's not just the most true or the most insightful. He's actually connected to God. He's intimately connected to God. His nature, the way a child is connected to a parent, his nature is connected to God. So that even God stands and speaks for him and says, "This one's mine." It's pretty profound to have God say, "Listen to him." You might think God would say, "This is my son, but listen to me." I mean, for God to say, "It's cool, whatever he says I'm cool with." That's a statement there. That's God saying, whatever comes out of his mouth is coming out of my mouth. I don't even know what he's going to say next, but I can tell you it's going to be perfect. From now on, listen to him. The more we can widen our understanding of Jesus, maybe beyond history, maybe beyond concept, maybe beyond human flesh, we're supposed to go beyond that. The more we push into mystery, into mysticism, into concept, into invisible truth and understanding, the closer we get to what the New Testament means by Christ. And this might be why Jesus says at the very end of this gospel, "Don't tell anybody until I've already died." Because in some sense, what we understand about Jesus has to die so that something new can be resurrected in its place. Our old concepts, laying them to rest and finding out what happens 3 days later as they rise again bigger and more glorious and more powerful than we realized. Even death and resurrection might be a process to continue to sow the seed, sow it in faith and with an open heart, and find out again and again how big and glorious the thing is.